My mother called me at 11:51 at night. I didn't even have to pick up the phone to know the exact tone she would use. It was that sharp, wine-soaked condescension that always made me feel like I was a stubborn kid breaking her favorite crystal vase. She didn't offer a greeting. She didn't ask how my children were doing. She just launched straight into the eviction of my soul. "Mason," she said, her voice dripping with this heavy, artificial regret that she probably practiced in the mirror. "Your father and I have made a decision. You and the kids aren't coming to the ski lodge for Christmas dinner this year." I stood in my kitchen, looking out at the city lights from the 54th floor. I didn't ask why. I didn't beg. I already knew the answer, but I let her say it anyway. "Your brother Elijah is bringing his new fiancé, Carter, to meet the extended family," she continued, her breathing quickening with excitement just saying the man's name. "Carter is a high-level executive, the kind of man who deals in millions and expects absolute perfection. Elijah doesn't want your messy toddlers running around. A single dad with two noisy kids just isn't going to work out with the image we need to project. They'd ruin the perfect image, Mason. Surely you understand that." "If you really want the kids to have their little gifts," my mother added, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper, "you can come to the service entrance after the sun goes down. I'll tell the estate staff to let you wait in the heated mechanical room by the boilers. You can see your brother from a distance, but you are not to step foot in the main dining hall. Carter doesn't need to know I have a son who couldn't keep his family together." I stared at the black marble of my kitchen counter. The silence in my penthouse was absolute. I felt the cold granite under my fingertips. I didn't yell. I didn't tell her that I was the one secretly paying for the very phone she was calling me from. "I understand perfectly, Mom," I said. "I really do." I hung up the phone before she could say another word. Later that week, they showed up at my Aspen estate, furious and demanding answers. And the moment Carter, my brother's arrogant fiancé, saw my wrist across the dining table, all the color drained from his face. He went dead pale, his hands shaking violently as he realized exactly whose house he had just broken into. Before I tell you about the absolute disaster that hit them that night, and the exact moment their perfect image shattered into a million unfixable pieces, please let me know where you are watching from in the comments section below. I love seeing where my listeners are from. Grab a warm cup of coffee, sit back, and listen to the whole story, because you are not going to believe the audacity of these people. To really make you understand how sweet that moment in Aspen was, I have to take you back. I have to explain why my mother thought I was a failure, and why I let her believe it for so long. You see, the pain doesn't start with a missed Christmas dinner. It started exactly 5 years ago, on a night where the rain was coming down so hard it felt like the sky itself was trying to wash me away. I was 27 years old. I had just gone through the most brutal custody battle of my entire life. My ex-wife had walked out on us, leaving me with 2 babies under the age of 2. The divorce was absolute hell. I was drowning in legal fees. Every single penny I had saved went straight to my lawyer just to ensure my kids wouldn't be taken away from me. I lost my apartment. I lost my entry-level finance job because my boss couldn't handle me missing work to attend mandatory court hearings. I had absolutely nothing left except a battered suitcase and my 2 sleeping children in the back of my old rusted sedan. With nowhere else to go, nowhere to turn, I drove to my parents' house in the suburbs. It was a massive, sprawling home with perfectly manicured lawns and a 3-car garage. I stood on their porch, the freezing rain soaking right through my thin jacket, and I rang the doorbell. My hands were shaking from the cold and the sheer exhaustion. My mother opened the door. She didn't look at my pale, exhausted face. She didn't look out at the car where her grandchildren were sleeping. She looked straight down at the cheap, wet suitcase sitting by my boots. Her face immediately tightened into a scowl. My brother Elijah stepped up behind her. He was 25 at the time, freshly graduated, wearing a ridiculously expensive cashmere sweater my parents had bought him to celebrate his new low-level marketing promotion. He crossed his arms, leaned against the doorframe, and smirked at me like I was a beggar off the street. "You can't stay here, Mason," my mother said, her voice entirely flat. We have guests coming this weekend for Elijah's promotion party. A son showing up with baggage and 2 crying babies doesn't fit the family brand. You're a failed investment, Mason. You made your bed. Now figure it out somewhere else. She closed the heavy oak door right in my face. The click of the deadbolt locking was the loudest sound I had ever heard in my life. I stood there in the freezing rain, water dripping down my face, and I made a silent promise to myself right then and there. I would never, ever be at the mercy of these people again. The next 5 years were a masterclass in sheer, unrelenting survival. I didn't just survive that rainy night. I let it fuel a fire inside me that burned hotter than anything my family could ever comprehend. I managed to rent a tiny, cramped 1-bedroom apartment on the wrong side of the tracks. The floorboards creaked so loud I had to memorize exactly where to step so I wouldn't wake the kids when I was pacing at night. I hired a young guy named Luke, a college student studying early childhood education, to watch my kids during the day. He was a godsend. While Luke watched my babies, I went to war with the world. I started taking freelance financial consulting gigs online. I worked 18-hour days every single day. I drank cheap, bitter coffee until my stomach physically burned. I would rock my daughter to sleep with one arm and type up massive risk assessment portfolios with the other. People think real wealth is built in shiny boardrooms with catered lunches. It's not. It's built at 3 a.m. at a cheap, wobbly folding table while the rest of the world is sleeping. That's when I met Matthew. He was an older, seasoned investor who had been burned badly by the big Wall Street firms. He saw something in my aggressive, no-nonsense approach to market analysis. We partnered up. We started buying up distressed assets, restructuring them, and flipping them quietly. We didn't want our names in the flashy financial papers. We wanted the raw power, not the fame. Within 3 years, we had formed Apex Holdings, a private equity juggernaut that moved quietly through the financial market like a ghost. By the time I was 32, I wasn't just wealthy. I was the chief executive officer and majority shareholder of an absolute empire. I owned a 54th-floor penthouse that looked down on the city. I had a private Gulfstream jet. My children were enrolled in the best private schools in the state, and Luke was now my full-time, highly paid estate manager. But my family didn't know a single detail about this. To them, I was still the miserable failure who got locked out in the rain. I intentionally kept my name off all public corporate registries. I drove a modest, 5-year-old sedan whenever I had to see them, which was rare. I wore plain, unbranded clothes. I played the part they desperately wanted me to play because I wanted to see exactly who they really were when they thought they held all the cards. And who they were was exactly who they had always been: greedy, superficial, and deeply flawed. About 3 years into my massive success, the harsh reality of my parents' reckless spending finally caught up with them. My father's business went bankrupt. That sprawling suburban house they loved so much was aggressively foreclosed on by the bank. They had absolutely nothing. Elijah, of course, was too busy pretending to be a wealthy big shot on social media to lift a finger to help them. He was living entirely on maxed-out credit cards, trying desperately to keep up appearances with his new upper-class friends. So, through a heavily layered dummy corporation, I rented a luxury high-rise apartment in the city. I paid the exorbitant $8,000 a month rent in full, completely anonymously, and had a fake property manager tell my mother she had won a highly exclusive subsidized housing lottery for distressed seniors. I paid for their electricity, their high-speed internet, their premium cable packages, everything. I did it because, despite everything, they were still my parents. I thought maybe losing everything would finally humble them. I thought maybe, just maybe, they would appreciate the quiet safety net. I was dead wrong. Whenever I visited them in that beautiful apartment, my mother would do nothing but complain. She hated the color of the imported marble in the kitchen. She complained that the building's concierge was too slow and disrespectful. She would look at me, sitting there in my plain clothes, and sigh heavily. "If you had just applied yourself, Mason," she would say, sipping expensive tea paid for entirely by my hidden money, "you could have provided a place like this for us. Instead, we have to rely on government charity while you still struggle to feed those kids of yours on whatever pathetic salary you make." My father would just sit there in his recliner, staring at the TV, offering no defense for me. I would just smile, nod, and take a sip of water. I never said a word. I let her live completely in her grand delusion. Let her think I was nothing. But the final straw, the exact moment the last remaining thread of my loyalty violently snapped, happened just 2 months before that infamous Christmas phone call. I was sitting in my massive corner office at Apex Holdings. The glass walls offered a breathtaking panoramic view of the entire city skyline. Matthew, my business partner and closest friend, walked in holding a thick, red confidential folder. He didn't look happy. In fact, he looked furious. He set it down heavily on my mahogany desk. "Mason," Matthew said, his voice grim and low. "Our forensic accounting department flagged something major on the personal trust accounts you set up for the kids." I frowned. I had set up an ironclad college fund for my 2 children, heavily guarded, but legally requiring a secondary family trustee just in case something tragic happened to me. I had foolishly put my mother's name down years ago, thinking it was just a standard legal formality. I never in a million years thought she would figure out how to access it, let alone try. I opened the heavy folder. Inside were stamped copies of multiple wire transfers. My mother, Margaret, had forged my signature and bypassed the security protocols to siphon exactly $100,000 out of my children's college fund. I felt a cold, hard knot form in the pit of my stomach. The money wasn't the issue. I made that much in interest before lunchtime. The issue was the sheer, horrific betrayal. She was stealing directly from the future of her own grandchildren. "Where did the money go?" I asked, my voice dangerously calm. Matthew flipped to the next page, pointing to a highlighted bank routing number. "She wired it directly to a premium event planning company in Boston. It was a massive, non-refundable deposit for Elijah's upcoming wedding to Carter." I sat back in my leather chair, staring at the ceiling. My mother had stolen my children's future to pay for a lavish, over-the-top party so her golden child could impress his wealthy fiancé. She was stealing from the son she threw away to glorify the son who did nothing but consume. I looked closer at the documents. There was another signature on the transfer authorization. Samuel, our longtime family lawyer. He was the one who notarized the forged documents. He helped her do it. "Do you want me to freeze the accounts and call the police?" Matthew asked, ready to pull the trigger and ruin them. I stared at the signatures for a long time. The anger that usually comes with betrayal wasn't there. Instead, there was just this icy, crystal-clear focus. I wasn't going to just call the police. That was far too easy. A simple arrest wouldn't destroy the fake reality they had built. I wanted them to climb all the way to the absolute top of their imaginary pedestal before I violently kicked it out from under them. "No," I said softly, a slow, dark smile spreading across my face. "Let the wire transfer clear. Let the money hit the venue's bank account." Matthew looked at me, totally confused. "Mason, that's $100 grand. That's grand larceny. It's federal wire fraud." "Exactly," I replied, closing the folder. "It's a digital trail. If we stop it now, she can claim it was an administrative error. If the money lands, the crime is complete. We let her hang herself with her own greed." Here is the thing my mother didn't know. Samuel wasn't her loyal accomplice. He was my employee. When I found out about the forgery a month prior, I didn't confront my mother. I went straight to Samuel's upscale law office. I sat across from his expensive oak desk, slid the undeniable evidence of his complicity across the table, and gave him a very simple choice. He could either face immediate disbarment, total public humiliation, and federal prison for assisting in wire fraud, or he could quietly work for me. As expected, the coward chose self-preservation. For the past month, Samuel had been feeding my mother enough legal loopholes to make her feel absolutely invincible. He helped her structure the stolen $100,000 through multiple interstate banks, intentionally triggering every single red flag the Securities and Exchange Commission looks for. He made sure the digital fingerprints belonged entirely to Margaret and Elijah. The trap wasn't just set. The steel jaws were already clamped tightly around their ankles. They just hadn't looked down yet to see the blood. On the night of that phone call, the night she told me I was banned from Christmas because my children were an embarrassment to Carter's perfect image, I walked over to the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse. The city below was a sea of glittering lights. My phone buzzed in my hand. It was a text message from a blocked number, but I knew exactly who it was from. The message read, "The secondary wire transfers are complete. The SEC bait is set. I'm sorry it had to come to this, Mason." It was from Samuel. The federal trap was officially armed. When I read that text, I didn't feel sad. I didn't feel rejected by my family. I felt completely, utterly free. The massive debt of blood and obligation was officially canceled. I put my phone in my pocket and walked over to the kitchen island. I picked up my tablet and opened the Savant home automation app. It was the master control for the luxury apartment I had been secretly paying for all these years. My mother had just told me I wasn't fit to sit at her table. She told me my children were a stain on her family image. She told me to go stand by the boilers like a stray dog. I looked at the glowing screen. I tapped the icon labeled Margaret Residence. With one deliberate, satisfying swipe of my finger, I revoked all guest privileges. I shut down the high-speed Wi-Fi network instantly. I canceled the premium cable packages she loved to watch all day. I disabled the smart thermostats, ensuring the brutal winter chill would quickly seep into the walls of the apartment. And finally, the most important part, I changed the digital lock codes on the heavy front door. I left her in the dark. In a freezing apartment she could no longer enter or exit freely, exactly where she wanted to keep me all those years ago. Let her experience the cold. The very next morning, while my mother was undoubtedly screaming at the building superintendent trying to figure out why her perfect life had just been shut off like a light switch, I was sitting in the plush leather seat of my private Gulfstream jet. We were 30,000 feet in the air, flying straight toward the snow-capped peaks of the Rockies. Matthew sat across from me, sliding a thick, heavy dossier across the mahogany table. "The Vanguard financial acquisition is completely finalized," Matthew said, tapping the cover of the file. $120 million. We own them lock, stock, and barrel as of 8 a.m. this morning. I opened the folder. Vanguard Financial was a massive asset management firm that had been struggling with bad leadership and bloated expenses for years. Apex Holdings had been quietly buying up their debt, backing them into a corner until a hostile takeover was their only option for survival. But that wasn't why I bought them. I didn't care about their portfolio. I bought them specifically for the man listed on page 4 of the executive summary. I stared down at the glossy corporate headshot of Carter, Elijah's fiancé, the man whose perfect image my children would supposedly ruin. He was a senior director of client relations at Vanguard. According to the highly detailed file, he was vastly underqualified, wildly overpaid, and had a nasty habit of using company funds to rent luxury properties to impress his personal guests. "He's middle management disguised as royalty," Matthew noted, following my gaze to the photo. "He's heavily in debt, Mason. He leased that flashy sports car he drives. He financed the engagement ring he gave your brother. He even has a secondary mortgage he's defaulting on. The guy is a walking house of cards. And my idiot brother thinks he's marrying a billionaire," I said, a dry, humorless laugh escaping my throat. "They really are a match made in heaven. Two parasites feeding off an illusion." We landed in Aspen a few hours later. The brutal cold mountain air hit my face like a wall as I stepped off the jet. A sleek, armored black SUV was waiting on the tarmac to take me directly to Obsidian Peak. Obsidian Peak wasn't just some rented ski lodge. It was my personal estate. It was a sprawling, 20,000 square foot architectural masterpiece made of black stone, reinforced steel, and massive panes of glass, built directly into the side of the mountain. It had a 30-foot heated marble foyer, a private chef's kitchen, an indoor pool, and a dining room that completely overlooked the valley. It was a fortress of absolute, unapologetic luxury. I arrived at the house, greeted by Joseph, my head butler and estate manager. Joseph was a distinguished older man who managed the property with strict military precision. "Welcome home, Mr. Mason," Joseph said, politely taking my heavy winter coat. "The house is fully prepped. Your security team, led by John, is stationed out of sight in the lower guest wing. However, we have a slight anomaly at the perimeter." Joseph handed me an iPad displaying the live high-definition feed from the front gate security cameras. A rented, mid-tier SUV was aggressively honking its horn at my massive wrought iron gates. Inside the car, I could clearly see my mother in the passenger seat, my father driving, and Elijah and Carter in the back. I raised an eyebrow, staring at the screen. How on earth did they find this exact place? "It appears Mr. Carter accessed the Vanguard Corporate Perks registry right before our acquisition lockout initiated," Joseph explained calmly. "He essentially stole the master key code for this property. He has logged it in his personal itinerary as a company retreat to impress his future in-laws. I had to hand it to him. The sheer, blinding audacity was almost impressive. Carter, a mid-level director drowning in debt, had stolen the access codes to his new boss's private multimillion-dollar estate to pretend he owned it for Christmas. I remembered what a mutual friend, Wyatt, had texted me a few days ago. Wyatt was a guy I grew up with, someone who deeply envied my success. Wyatt knew I owned massive property in Aspen. He had maliciously slipped the location to Elijah, hoping my loud, obnoxious family would crash my quiet holiday. Wyatt was a snake, but right now his betrayal was playing perfectly into my hands. "Sir, shall I have John and the security team escort them off the mountain immediately?" Joseph asked, his finger hovering over the radio comms button. "No," I said softly, my eyes fixed intently on the camera feed. I watched my mother shivering in her cheap faux fur coat as Carter aggressively punched the stolen code into the keypad. The light blinked green. The massive gates slowly swung open. "Let them in, Joseph," I instructed, handing the iPad back to him. "Instruct all the staff to completely disappear. No one is to be seen. I will handle our guests personally." Joseph bowed slightly. "As you wish, sir." I walked into the staff quarters, opened the supply closet, and pulled out a simple, black cashmere service apron. I tied it tightly around my waist, over my plain sweater. I checked my reflection in the polished steel of the kitchen refrigerator. I didn't look like a billionaire CEO. I looked exactly like the pathetic failure they expected me to be. I looked like the hired help. I walked out into the grand foyer and stood silently by the massive interior oak doors, waiting for the storm to blow inside. The heavy oak doors of Obsidian Peak swung open with a violent rush of freezing wind. Snow swirled across the heated black marble floor of the magnificent foyer. My mother, Margaret, stomped inside first, violently shaking the snow off her coat like a wet dog. My father, Robert, followed meekly behind her, sweating as he carried 3 heavy designer knockoff suitcases. Elijah and Carter strolled in last, laughing loudly about something, their breath pluming in the freezing air. "My God, Carter, it's absolutely magnificent," my mother gasped, her voice echoing loudly off the 30-foot ceilings. She spun around wildly, taking in the massive modern chandelier, the expensive abstract art on the walls, and the sheer, breathtaking scale of the space. "It's a literal palace. I can't believe this is yours." Carter puffed out his chest, completely ignoring the fact that he had stolen the entry code and was trespassing. "Well, Vanguard takes very good care of its top executives, Margaret. Consider this your home for the holidays. Only the best for my new family." Then, Margaret turned her head and saw me. I was standing perfectly still next to the coat closet, my hands clasped professionally in front of me, wearing the black service apron. The overwhelming joy instantly vanished from her face. Her features violently twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. Her eyes widened, not with guilt for what she had done to my children's fund, but with sheer disgust that my presence was ruining her aesthetic moment. "Mason!" she shrieked, her voice cutting through the massive room like a rusty saw. "What in the hell are you doing here?" She didn't wait for an answer. She marched furiously across the heated marble floor, her heels clicking aggressively. When she reached me, she didn't hesitate for a second. She raised her hand and slapped me hard across the face. The sound cracked like a whip in the cavernous foyer. My head snapped violently to the side. I tasted the sharp, metallic tang of copper in my mouth where my teeth bit into my inner cheek. I didn't flinch. I didn't raise my hands to defend myself. I slowly turned my head back to look at her, my eyes as dead and cold as the obsidian stone beneath our feet. "I told you," she hissed, pointing a trembling, manicured finger at my chest. "You were not invited. You and your baggage are not welcome in Carter's home. How did you even find us? Are you stalking your brother now to beg for money?" Carter stepped forward, puffing his chest out further to look authoritative. "I specifically told the Vanguard concierge I didn't want any local staff here. I hired a private cleaning crew to prep the house, but I didn't think they'd hire a charity case. Get out of the foyer and get to the kitchen right now. You don't stand in the entryway of a property like this. You look ridiculous." I caught Carter's eye for a split second. He was trying to act tough in front of his future in-laws, but I saw the slight, unmistakable tremor in his right hand. He was absolutely terrified that the Real owner might show up and discover his trespassing. He had no idea the real owner was the man he just ordered into the kitchen. I smoothed down my apron calmly. "I apologize for the intrusion, sir," I said, my voice perfectly flat, entirely devoid of emotion. "I will prepare the dining room for your evening meal." I turned on my heel and walked down the long, quiet hallway toward the kitchen. I could hear Elijah laughing cruelly behind me. "God, he's pathetic," Elijah sneered. 32 years old and still carrying bags and wearing aprons. It's embarrassing to even share a last name with him. "Some people are just born to serve, Elijah," my mother replied, her tone dripping with intense satisfaction. "It's a complete lack of ambition. Mason always preferred the dirt to the gold." I walked into the massive chef's kitchen and closed the door softly. I wiped the small drop of blood from the corner of my mouth. I wasn't angry. Anger is a hot, uncontrolled, messy emotion. What I felt was absolute, freezing clarity. They were walking blindly into a wood chipper, and they were complaining about the noise. An hour later, the dinner in the formal dining room of Obsidian Peak was a masterclass in absolute delusion. The dining table was a massive slab of polished mahogany that seated 20 people comfortably. Carter naturally took the head of the table like a king. He was pouring generous glasses of my personal, 50-year-old single malt scotch, swirling it arrogantly in the crystal tumbler. Elijah leaned into him, his eyes glittering with a predatory kind of triumph, completely oblivious to the massive financial ruin looming over his entire family. My parents sat across from them, acting like the royal monarchs of a castle they had absolutely no right to be in. They looked so pleased with themselves, so completely detached from reality. I brought out the first course, a delicate Wagyu beef carpaccio that my private chef had prepped before leaving for the night. I moved silently around the table, pouring wine, clearing small plates, playing the perfect, invisible servant. Carter took a bite and loudly, obnoxiously chewed. "So, Mason," he said, not even bothering to look up at me. "Elijah tells me you struggled heavily with child custody a few years back. Nasty business, divorce. Good thing you don't have the kids with you tonight. This environment is for adults who actually understand wealth." He took a large gulp of my expensive scotch. "You know, with my new promotion and my executive salary, I could probably pull some strings. Get you a job in the mailroom at Vanguard. Give you a chance to earn a real paycheck instead of relying on leftover tips." "That's incredibly generous of you, Carter," my mother chimed in eagerly, glaring at me. "You should say thank you, Mason. Carter is offering you a literal lifeline out of poverty." I stepped behind Elijah's chair with a heavy bottle of vintage, $5,000 red wine to refill his glass. "I don't know, Mom," Elijah mocked, his voice a sharp, nasal whine that grated on my nerves. "I don't think Mason has the brain capacity for a real corporate office. Look at him. Imagine being in your 30s and still pouring drinks for people who actually made something of themselves. It must be so exhausting to have a life that's nothing but failure and regret. I leaned over slightly to pour the wine. My movements were slow, incredibly precise, and completely steady. I didn't let a single drop spill. Suddenly, Elijah jerked his elbow backward with a violent, practiced motion. He slammed his arm directly into my wrist on purpose. The heavy crystal wine glass tipped over immediately. A dark, crimson wave of $5,000 vintage red wine cascaded off the mahogany table and splashed directly onto the front of my white shirt and my black cashmere apron. The deep stain spread instantly, looking like a massive, bleeding wound across my chest. The sound of the heavy glass hitting the solid wood table was like a gunshot in the quiet room. Elijah gasped, letting out a fake, high-pitched sound of absolute shock. "Oh my God! You clumsy idiot! Look what you did! You got it all over the table. You're completely incompetent." My father just shook his head in pure disgust. My mother didn't even flinch. She just stared at the red stain dripping from my apron onto the heated marble floor. "Clean it up, Mason," my mother ordered, her voice cold and utterly unforgiving. "Get on your knees and clean it up right now. Use your bare hands if you have to. It's the only thing you're good for." I didn't move to get a towel. I didn't apologize. I didn't get on my knees. I simply stood there, perfectly straight, letting the expensive wine drip from my clothes onto the floor. The room went dead silent, and then Carter stopped laughing. Carter, who had been grinning arrogantly a second ago, suddenly went bone white. His eyes locked onto my left wrist, which had been exposed when Elijah violently knocked my arm back. He wasn't looking at the spilled wine. He wasn't looking at the stain. Carter was staring, with sheer, unadulterated terror, at the custom, diamond-encrusted cufflink securing my sleeve. It was the Founder's Edition. There were only 5 of them in existence, and they were exclusively worn by the board members of Apex Holdings, the massive company that had just bought his entire life. The air in the formal dining room of Obsidian Peak didn't just turn cold. It vanished. The oxygen was entirely sucked out of the space. Carter, who had just been laughing loudly, stopped breathing. His jaw went completely slack. His expensive, perfectly manicured hands started to shake so violently that the ice in his scotch glass rattled against the crystal. He wasn't looking at the red wine dripping off my chin. He wasn't looking at the stain ruining my apron. He was staring dead at my left wrist. When Elijah violently knocked my arm backward, my sleeve had hiked up just enough to expose my cuff. Secured tightly in the buttonhole was a solid platinum cufflink, heavily encrusted with crushed diamonds, formed into the sharp, geometric crest of Apex Holdings. It was the Founder's Edition. There are exactly 5 of these in the entire world. They were minted on the day Apex cleared its first $1 billion in managed assets, and they are exclusively worn by the executive board members. Carter worked in high finance. He knew exactly what that crest meant. More importantly, he knew exactly who had just executed a hostile takeover of his firm, Vanguard Financial, at 8 a.m. that very morning. The massive merger had sent shockwaves through the industry. Everyone at Vanguard was terrified of the faceless, ruthless CEO of Apex who was coming to clean house. And now that very CEO was standing in front of him, covered in cheap wine, holding a serving towel. "Carter?" Elijah asked, his nasal voice tinged with sudden confusion. He reached out and touched Carter's shoulder. "Babe, what's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost. Are you feeling sick?" Carter didn't answer. He couldn't. His eyes slowly trailed up from my wrist, past the stained apron, and finally locked onto my face. The sheer, unadulterated terror in his eyes was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. He was a man watching his entire life, his career, his status, completely incinerate in real time. My mother, completely oblivious to the silent transaction of power happening at the table, scoffed loudly. "Carter, don't let this clumsy fool ruin your evening. I told you he was a disaster. Mason, I told you to get on your knees and clean up this mess. If you don't scrub this floor right now, I will personally ensure Carter has you fired from whatever pathetic temp agency sent you here. I reached into the deep pocket of my black service apron. I didn't pull out a towel. I pulled out a single, neatly folded sheet of heavy stock paper. I didn't say a word. I simply stepped forward and slid the paper directly across the polished mahogany table. I slid it right through the puddle of spilled red wine. The expensive vintage soaked into the edges of the paper, turning it the color of dried blood. I pushed it until it stopped exactly an inch away from Carter's trembling fingers. It was the official whistleblower receipt from the Securities and Exchange Commission. It explicitly detailed the $100,000 fraudulent wire transfer that Margaret and Elijah had executed to embezzle from my children's trust fund. It had all the routing numbers. It had the forged signatures. And at the bottom, it had the official stamp of a pending federal investigation. Carter looked down at the paper. His eyes darted across the text. I watched his throat bob as he swallowed hard. He read the names. Margaret, Elijah, wire fraud, grand larceny. Then he looked at the name of the victim, the owner of the trust, Mason. Carter looked at the paper, then at me, then at the terrified, completely confused faces of the family he thought was his golden ticket to a high society dynasty. He was engaged to a man who was about to be indicted by the federal government for stealing from a billionaire. I leaned in. The deferential, quiet posture of the hired help instantly evaporated. I stood up to my full height, rolling my shoulders back. I placed both hands firmly on the table and leaned toward Carter. My voice was no longer flat. It was a low, lethal whisper that cut through the silence of the room like a scalpel. I think it's time we stopped pretending. Don't you, Carter? I said. Carter swallowed a strangled gasp. He knew exactly who was standing over him, and he knew that in about 10 seconds, his entire world was going to end. What is that? Elijah demanded, trying to snatch the paper from the table. What are you showing him? Mason, what kind of sick joke are you playing? I ignored my brother completely. I stood up slowly, the wine-soaked cashmere apron feeling heavy and sticky against my chest. I didn't rush. I didn't yell. Panic is for people who don't have control. I had absolute control. I reached behind my neck, untied the wet apron, and let it drop to the floor. It hit the heated marble with a heavy, wet thud. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my smartphone. I pressed my thumb against the biometric scanner. A low, mechanical hiss echoed through the massive dining room as the heavy-duty smart locks on every single exterior door of the estate simultaneously engaged. The heavy steel bolts slid into place with a definitive clack. The soft hum of the high-speed Wi-Fi router in the corner cut out instantly, leaving the room in a heavy, pressurized silence. Elijah's phone, which had been buzzing non-stop with social media notifications, went completely dark. He tapped the screen frantically. Hey, the internet just died. I have no signal. What did you do? What is this? My mother demanded, her voice rising in a panicked screech. She stood up from her chair, her face flushed with anger. Mason, stop playing these stupid games. Turn the internet back on and clean up this mess before I call the police and have you arrested for trespassing. I finally looked directly at her. You aren't calling anyone, Mom. And you certainly aren't calling the police. They are already on their way. But they aren't coming for me. With a quick flick of my wrist, I mirrored my phone's display to the massive, 100-inch gallery screen mounted on the far wall of the dining room. The screen didn't show lovely family vacation photos. It lit up the room with cold, hard reality. The massive display showed two side-by-side documents. On the left was the massive red-stamped audit from the Securities and Exchange Commission detailing the wire fraud. On the right was the official acquisition contract between Apex Holdings and Vanguard Financial, complete with my bold signature at the very bottom as the sole purchasing authority. Elijah squinted at the screen, his brain struggling to comprehend the complex legal jargon. Apex Holdings? Vanguard? What does this mean? Carter, what is he showing us? Carter's chair scraped violently against the floor as he stood up. He stood up so fast he nearly tipped the heavy mahogany chair completely backward. His breathing was incredibly shallow, practically hyperventilating. His eyes darted frantically from the massive screen to my face, then back to the screen. He wasn't a millionaire. He wasn't a titan of industry. He was a mid-level director at a firm I had purchased just 12 hours ago. He was an ant and I was the magnifying glass. "Carter," I said, my voice as cold as the solid ice forming on the massive windows outside. "You've had a very busy month, haven't you? You authorized fraudulent corporate perks for a family of known embezzlers. You leased a car you can't afford. And, most impressively, you used a stolen executive key code to illegally enter a private, multimillion-dollar estate that belongs to your new boss." Elijah grabbed Carter's arm, his perfectly manicured nails digging deep into Carter's expensive suit sleeve. "Babe, what is he talking about? Tell him he's lying. Tell him you own this place. Carter, say something." Carter violently yanked his arm away from Elijah, as if my brother's touch was physically toxic. He actually recoiled in disgust. "Shut up, Elijah," Carter hissed, his face a sickening, pale shade of gray. His voice cracked with sheer panic. "Just shut your stupid mouth. You have absolutely no idea who you are talking to. He's not the help." My mother gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles turning white. "Carter, don't speak to my son that way. Mason is a failure. He's a broke, divorced loser who couldn't even keep a roof over his head. He's the chairman of Apex Holdings." Carter screamed, completely losing whatever composure he had left. He pointed a shaking finger at me. "He owns my firm. He owns the bank that holds my mortgage. He literally owns my entire career. And this is his house. We broke into his house." The silence that followed was deafening. It was the kind of silence that happens right after a bomb goes off, before the dust even begins to settle. My mother slowly turned her head to look at me. The smug, condescending sneer was completely gone. In its place was a look of absolute soul-crushing horror. Her eyes darted around the luxurious dining room, taking in the 50-year-old scotch, the Wagyu beef, the massive chandelier. She was finally realizing that the son she had discarded like trash had built a literal empire, and she had just slapped him across the face in his own foyer. My father sank slowly back into his chair, his hands covering his face. He knew it was over. Carter turned back to me. His hands were shaking so badly he had to grip the back of his chair to stay upright. All his arrogance, all his snide comments about putting me in the mailroom, vanished completely. "Mr. Mason." "Sir," Carter stammered, his voice dropping an octave as he practically begged. I was completely misled. I had absolutely no idea they were stealing from your children's trust. I swear to God. Elijah told me it was family money. He told me you were completely estranged. I didn't know you owned Vanguard. I can fix this. Please, sir. Don't ruin me. I didn't blink. I didn't show a single ounce of mercy. You can start by taking back that ring, I said smoothly, pointing to the massive diamond engagement ring glittering on Elijah's finger. According to my audit, that ring was purchased using a corporate bonus advance from Vanguard. A bonus that I, as the new chairman, have officially decided not to approve. That ring is company property. Elijah gasped, clutching his left hand to his chest. "No, you can't do that. Carter gave this to me. We're getting married." "Take the ring off, Elijah," Carter demanded, his voice suddenly vicious. He turned on the man he supposedly loved without a second of hesitation. "Give it back to me right now. You told me your family had money. You told me this was a wealthy dynasty. You're nothing but a bunch of broke, thieving frauds. Give me the ring." Elijah started to cry, real, ugly tears streaming down his face as he struggled to pull the tight band off his finger. He practically threw it at Carter, who caught it and immediately shoved it deep into his pocket. "Good," I said, my voice dangerously soft. "And now, Carter, since you brought these trespassers into my home, you can personally escort them out. This is the moment that changes everything, the moment I finally took back control of my life. Thank you so much for your patience and for staying with me until now. You've been amazing." Please give this video a like and comment 1 below to let me know you've made it this far. Not only does this help more people find this story, but it also lets me know that my experiences truly mean something to someone. Your support is my greatest motivation to keep sharing the rest of this journey. I didn't wait for Carter to argue. I reached into my pocket, pulled out my phone, and hit a single red button on the Savant app screen. The massive front doors of the grand foyer immediately swung open, inviting the howling, freezing aspen blizzard directly into the house. The temperature in the room plummeted in seconds. From the shadows of the long hallway, John, my massive head of security, stepped out. He was followed by 3 other heavily built security guards wearing sharp black suits and earpieces. Their expressions were as blank and unyielding as the stone walls of the estate. They didn't look like bouncers. They looked like a tactical extraction team. "Mr. Mason," John said, his voice a deep, authoritative rumble. "Shall we clear the trash, sir?" "Yes, John," I replied, not breaking eye contact with my mother. "These people are trespassing on private property." Margaret tried to stand up, but her knees entirely gave out. She sank back heavily into her mahogany chair, her hands trembling wildly. The absolute reality of her situation was finally crashing down on her. The money she stole was tracked. The house wasn't hers. The son she hated held all the power, and the son she worshipped was currently sobbing over a repossessed ring. "Mason, please," my mother choked out, her voice cracking with desperate, pathetic tears. She reached a shaking hand out across the table toward me. "Please, there's a blizzard out there. It's 20 degrees below zero. We have nowhere to go. We don't have a hotel. We don't have any money. Mason, I'm your mother. It's Christmas." I looked down at the woman who had locked me out in the freezing rain 5 years ago when I had 2 infant children in my arms. I looked at the woman who told me to go stand by the boilers in the mechanical room so I wouldn't ruin her aesthetic. I felt absolutely nothing for her. No love, no hate, just a cold, vast emptiness. "I'm just protecting the image, Mom," I said, throwing her exact words right back in her face. "A family of federal felons just doesn't fit the Apex Holdings corporate brand. Surely you understand that." I nodded to John. Within 30 seconds, the screaming, the crying, and the desperate pleading were physically dragged out of the dining room. John and his men didn't use excessive force, but they didn't offer an ounce of gentleness either. They grabbed the heavy designer suitcases my father had brought in and tossed them roughly out onto the snow-covered driveway. My father was completely silent. He didn't say a single word as the guards escorted him out. He just kept his head down in total shame. Elijah fought the guards, screaming curses at me, calling me a monster, right up until the moment they deposited him on the icy pavement. Carter practically ran out the door on his own, clutching his Vanguard access badge like a pathetic lifeline, desperately hoping I wouldn't call the police on him for breaking and entering. He sprinted past my mother, completely abandoning his future in-laws to fend for themselves in the snow. I walked slowly out to the grand foyer. I stood in the doorway, the freezing mountain wind biting at my face, and I watched them. I watched my mother shivering in her cheap coat. I watched my brother crying over his lost status. I watched them stumble through the heavy snow down the long, winding driveway of Obsidian Peak, swallowed entirely by the shadows of the storm. I hit the button on the wall panel. The massive oak doors swung shut, sealing perfectly. The heavy deadbolts engaged with a satisfying final click. The howling of the wind was instantly cut off. The house was finally quiet. I stood in the massive, luxurious foyer entirely alone. The air inside the estate felt completely different. Felt lighter. Felt clean. The toxic, suffocating weight that had been pressing down on my chest for 32 years was completely gone. The storm raging outside Obsidian Peak wasn't just weather. It was a massive, violent cleaning crew, washing away the last remnants of a family that never deserved me. Fan 7, Subpart 7.1. Ban Tin Sang Ham Sao Va Ban on So Tu Sap Viet. 1202. By the time the sun actually rose on December 26th, The local news cycle was absolutely buzzing. The headline wasn't about a lavish high society Christmas party in Boston. It wasn't about Elijah's glamorous wedding. It was all about the massive Aspen embezzlement scandal. My mother and brother didn't spend the rest of their Christmas night in a warm motel. With no money, no credit cards, and a massive storm trapping them in town, they were eventually picked up by the local police for loitering inside a closed gas station. But that was just the beginning. The Securities and Exchange Commission doesn't take time off for the holidays. By the end of January, the federal indictments were officially unsealed. The trial was brief and incredibly brutal. I didn't even have to testify. The digital trail Samuel had helped them create was so damning, so flawlessly documented, that their own defense attorney practically begged them to take a plea deal. They refused, completely blinded by their own delusion, thinking they could charm their way out of federal fraud. The judge assigned to their case was Judge Gray. She was a tough, no-nonsense woman who had spent 30 years on the bench watching wealthy social climbers fall from grace. She didn't care about my mother's aesthetic. She didn't care about Elijah's social media following. All she cared about was the fact that a grandmother had forged documents to steal $100,000 from the educational trust of 2 innocent toddlers. When it came time for sentencing, Judge Gray looked down at my mother with absolute disgust. "Margaret," Judge Gray said, her voice echoing in the quiet courtroom, "you have shown zero remorse. You stole from your own blood to fund a lifestyle of pure vanity. You are a predator cloaked in expensive clothing." Margaret was sentenced to 6 years in a state penitentiary facility. Elijah, because of his direct involvement and his complete lack of cooperation, received a 4-year sentence for his role in the criminal conspiracy. On top of the prison time, the court ordered a total financial restitution of $142,000. Every single penny they had stolen from the trust, plus all the extensive legal fees I had racked up having my firm hunt them down. My parents' remaining meager assets were entirely liquidated. My father, thoroughly disgraced and broken, had to move into a tiny, run-down assisted living facility on the outskirts of the city. The social fallout from the trial was even more lethal than the legal one. The wealthy friends my mother had spent decades trying so desperately to impress didn't send heartfelt letters of support. They didn't start a defense fund. They blocked her phone number and deleted her from their social media before her first mugshot even went viral on the local news networks. Carter didn't fare much better in the aftermath. The morning after the Aspen disaster, I officially took my seat as chairman at Vanguard Financial. My very first executive action was to call Carter into the main boardroom. I didn't yell. I didn't gloat. I simply handed him his immediate termination papers, citing severe ethics violations and unauthorized use of company assets. His professional reputation in the high finance world was completely incinerated overnight. No reputable firm in the entire country wants to hire a director who gets scammed by a family of frauds and breaks into his boss's house. Last I heard through the industry grapevine, Carter is currently working a miserable, mid-level analyst job in a small, depressing city where absolutely nobody knows his name. He lives in a tiny studio apartment that costs less in rent than the luxury watch I used to let him wear. And Wyatt, the supposed friend who leaked the location of my Aspen estate? I didn't sue him. I didn't confront him. I simply used my influence to quietly ensure he was blacklisted from every exclusive country club, investment circle, and high society event in the state. He wanted to play games with the elite, so I permanently revoked his invitation. He is completely isolated, left to rot in his own jealousy. About 3 months after the sentencing, I received a thick manila envelope in the mail. The return address was the minimum security state correctional facility where my mother was currently being held. I sat at my massive desk in the penthouse, looking at her handwriting. I opened the envelope. Inside were 8 pages of lined paper, covered edge to edge in the exact same toxic poison she had always spewed. "Mason, I'm still your mother," she wrote in the very first paragraph. "I did all of this to give our family a future. You are the one who destroyed us. You set us up. You are a terrible son." I stopped reading. I didn't read the second page. I didn't even scan the rest of the letter. 5 years ago, A letter like that would have completely broken me. I would have spent days agonizing over it, wondering what I did wrong, wondering how I could fix it. But sitting there, looking at those desperate, manipulative words, I felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no familiar tightening in my chest, just a wave of pure, unadulterated indifference. I took the 8 pages, walked over to the heavy-duty industrial shredder next to my desk, and dropped them straight into the slot. The mechanical hum of the machine violently destroying her words was the only reply she was ever going to get from me. I realized right then that the opposite of love isn't hate. Hate takes energy. Hate requires you to care. The opposite of love is silence. That night, my chosen family gathered at my penthouse. The massive dining table was empty. Instead, we were all sitting comfortably on the plush living room rug. My brilliant assistant Matthew was there, laughing loudly. John, my giant head of security, was sitting cross-legged, trying to fold a tiny paper airplane. Luke, the loyal nanny who had helped me raise my kids when I had absolutely nothing to my name, was busy handing out slices of pepperoni pizza. And my 2 children, safe, happy, and completely oblivious to the darkness of the world, were busy building a massive fort out of designer moving boxes in the corner of the room. We didn't talk about stock portfolios. We didn't talk about corporate image. We didn't talk about the people sitting in prison cells. We just ate pizza on the floor and enjoyed the warmth of the room. For the first time in my entire life, my home didn't feel like a cold, rigid showroom designed to impress strangers. It felt like a true sanctuary. I want you to look closely at this situation for a second. I'm Mason. I am 32 years old, and I am finally completely free. People told me for years that blood is thicker than water. They use that phrase constantly to trap you, to make you feel guilty for walking away from toxic abuse. But they always conveniently forget the rest of the actual quote. The blood of the covenant is thicker than the water of the womb. The family you actively choose, the people who stand by you when you are standing in the freezing rain with a broken suitcase, those are your real family. You are absolutely allowed to walk away from people who hurt you, even if you share a last name. You do not owe your peace, your sanity, or your wealth to anyone who treats your mere existence like a liability. Setting a boundary isn't an act of war. It is an act of essential self-preservation. If you are sitting at a table where you constantly have to shrink yourself down just to fit in, stand up and leave. Go build your own table. Build a massive empire if you have to. But never, ever let someone make you feel small in a house that you paid for with your own strength. Thank you for sticking around and listening to my story. It's not easy opening up about the darkest moments of my past, but sharing it with all of you makes the burden feel so much lighter. I hope this resonated with you in some way, especially if you've ever felt like the black sheep of your own family. Have you ever found yourself in a similar situation? Have you ever had to completely cut ties with a toxic family member to save your own sanity? I want to read your stories. Drop down into the comments right now and tell me about the boundaries you've had to set. We can all learn from each other's strength. Now for a special request. If you are hearing my voice right now, it means you didn't click away. It means you stayed through the pain, the struggle, and the final victory. You are part of what I like to call the 1% Club. To prove you made it all the way to the very end, I want you to go to the comments and simply type the letter W. W stands for winner. When I see that W, I'll know that you are one of the amazing people who understand what it really takes to survive and win. Please don't forget to hit that like button. It really helps push this story out to people who might desperately need to hear it today. And if you want to join our growing community of winners, hit follow. I have so many more stories to share, and I'd love for you to be here for the next one. Stay strong, protect your peace, and I will see you in the next video.